Some secrets are buried so deep that you spend your entire life building yourself on top of them, never knowing that everything you believe about yourself is a carefully constructed lie. I lived 22 years thinking I knew exactly who I was, where I came from, and why my life had unfolded the way it did. But on what should have been the proudest day of my life, everything I thought I knew came crashing down in the most devastating way possible. My name is Alexander, and this is the story of how I discovered that my entire existence was built on deception, and how I made sure the people responsible paid the ultimate price for stealing my identity, my family, and my future. Growing up, I always felt like something was missing. Not in a dramatic, soul-searching way, but in those quiet moments when you catch yourself wondering why you don't quite fit the puzzle of your own family. My parents, Patricia and Kenneth Morrison, were good people, hard-working, middle-class folks who provided everything I needed. But there was always this invisible wall between us, this distance I could never quite bridge no matter how hard I tried. Patricia worked as a nurse at the local hospital, always coming home exhausted, but still managing to make dinner and help with homework. Kenneth was a mechanic who ran his own small garage, hands perpetually stained with motor oil, but always ready to teach me how to fix things around the house. They weren't neglectful or cruel, just distant, like they were going through the motions of being parents without ever really connecting with the role. I excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science, which seemed to surprise them. When I brought home report cards with straight A's, they'd smile and say they were proud, but it felt rehearsed, like they were reading lines from a script they'd memorized but never really understood. When I got accepted into the state university's engineering program with a full scholarship, their reaction was strange. Pride mixed with something else, something that looked almost like guilt. "We always knew you were special, Alex," Patricia had said, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine when she said it. College was where I truly came alive. Away from that invisible wall, I flourished. I made friends easily, excelled in my studies, and even met Sarah, the woman I planned to marry after graduation. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. My professors recognized my potential, and by senior year, I had already received job offers from 3 major engineering firms. But even during those successful college years, questions lingered. When I'd bring Sarah home for holidays, she'd always comment on how different I seemed around my parents, how I became quieter, more reserved. She was studying psychology and had this way of noticing things others missed. "It's like you're performing when you're with them," she'd say gently. "Like you're trying to be someone you think they want you to be." I'd brush off her observations, but deep down, I knew she was right. There was something fundamentally wrong with the dynamic in my family, something I couldn't put my finger on but could never ignore completely. The night before my graduation, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't excitement or nervousness about the ceremony. It was something deeper, a restlessness that had been building for months. I kept thinking about my childhood, about the gaps in our family photos, about how my parents never talked about our extended family, about how I'd never met my grandparents or even knew if they were alive. I'd asked about our family history countless times over the years, but the answers were always vague. "Your grandparents passed when you were very young," or "We're not close with the extended family." When I pressed for details, the conversations would always end abruptly, with Patricia getting emotional and Kenneth changing the subject. Graduation day dawned bright and clear. As I put on my cap and gown, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and melancholy that had become my normal state around family events. I was about to receive my degree in mechanical engineering, summa cum laude, and I had already accepted a position with a prestigious firm in the city. This should have been the culmination of everything I'd worked for, the moment my parents could finally see their investment in me pay off. The ceremony was beautiful. As I walked across that stage and received my diploma, I searched the crowd for my parents' faces. There they were in the 3rd row, clapping politely. Patricia was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but something about her tears didn't look like joy. Kenneth's applause seemed mechanical, his smile forced. Even in my moment of triumph, I felt that familiar distance. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, mine felt oddly subdued. We took the obligatory pictures, had lunch at a nice restaurant, and made small talk about my upcoming job. But there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't identify, like they were all waiting for something to happen. It was Sarah who suggested we stop by the house before heading back to campus for the graduation party. "I left my earrings in your old room," she said, but I suspected she just wanted to give my parents more time to open up, to show some genuine emotion about this milestone in my life. We drove to the house in separate cars, my parents in their old sedan, Sarah and I in my beat-up Honda. The house looked the same as always, a modest two-story in a quiet neighborhood, well-maintained but unremarkable. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Patricia and Kenneth having what looked like an intense conversation in their car. When they saw us approaching, they quickly composed themselves. "Why don't you kids go on in?" Kenneth said, his voice strained. "We'll be right behind you." Sarah and I entered through the front door and she headed upstairs to retrieve her earrings. I wandered into the living room, looking at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. It was something I'd done thousands of times before, but today, with my heightened emotional state, I found myself really studying them for the first time. There were pictures of me at various ages, from baby photos to high school graduation. But as I looked closer, something struck me as odd. In the earlier photos, the ones from when I was very young, I looked different. Not just younger, but actually different. My hair was darker, my features sharper. I'd always attributed this to normal childhood changes, but now, seeing them all together, the transformation seemed more dramatic than it should have been. I picked up a photo from what appeared to be my 3rd birthday party. The little boy in the picture was undeniably me, but he looked nothing like the later photos. His eyes were a different shape, his nose was different, even the structure of his face seemed completely different. It was like looking at 2 different children. "That's impossible," I whispered to myself, but even as I said it, a cold dread was settling in my stomach. I heard footsteps upstairs and Sarah's voice calling down that she'd found her earrings. My parents still hadn't come inside, and I found myself drawn to the old photo albums that were stored in the cabinet beneath the family photos. I'd looked through these albums countless times as a child, but always under supervision, always with my parents narrating the memories. Now, alone with them for the first time, I began flipping through with adult eyes and a growing sense of unease. The albums told a story that didn't make sense. There were photos of Patricia and Kenneth as a young couple. Then suddenly there were photos of them with a baby that looked like the child in my 3rd birthday photo. But there were no pregnancy photos of Patricia, no hospital pictures, no gradual progression from couple to family. It was as if I had simply appeared in their lives as a fully formed toddler. And then, about halfway through the album, the photos changed. The child who had appeared as a toddler was gone, replaced by a different child who looked like me from age 4 onward. Same parents, same house, but completely different child. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages, searching for any explanation, any caption or note that might make sense of what I was seeing. But there was nothing. Just the stark evidence that I was looking at photos of 2 different children being presented as the same person. That's when I heard Patricia's voice from the kitchen, talking to Kenneth in hushed, urgent tones. "We should have told him years ago," she was saying. "This was bound to happen eventually." "What choice did we have?" Kenneth replied, his voice heavy with what sounded like years of suppressed guilt. "After what happened to the real Alexander, we couldn't just let this one go back into the system. He was so traumatized, so broken. We gave him a good life, didn't we? But he's not our son," Patricia said, and her words hit me like a physical blow. "He's never been our son. And now he's graduated, he's starting his own life, and we're still living this lie." I felt the room spinning around me. The photo album slipped from my hands and fell to the floor with a soft thud, but I barely heard it over the roaring in my ears. I wasn't their son. I wasn't Alexander Morrison. Everything I thought I knew about myself, every memory, every assumption about my identity was a lie. "What happened to the real Alexander?" I heard Kenneth ask, his voice barely a whisper. "You know what happened," Patricia replied, and I could hear tears in her voice now. "The accident. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. We were just supposed to take care of him temporarily while his real parents recovered. But then they died in that second crash," Kenneth finished. "And we had already grown attached to this one, and he was so confused, so scared. It seemed kinder to let him believe he belonged with us. But his real family," Patricia continued, "they've been looking for him all these years. His grandparents, his aunts and uncles. They never stopped looking for Michael. Michael. My real name was Michael. I stood frozen in the living room, feeling like my entire world was collapsing around me. Everything made sense now. The distance I'd always felt from my parents, the way they seemed to be acting out roles rather than living them, the gaps in our family history, the lack of extended family. They weren't my parents. They were strangers who had stolen my identity and kept me from my real family for 18 years. But there was more. I could hear them moving around in the kitchen now, and their conversation continued. "The worst part is the money," Kenneth was saying. "All these years we've been collecting the life insurance money from his real parents' deaths, money that should have gone to him to help him build his life. $300,000, Patricia whispered. "It's all still sitting in that account. We never touched it, but we never told him about it either. It was supposed to be his college fund, his inheritance, but we let him struggle with student loans instead. $300,000. Money from my real parents' life insurance, money that could have paid for my entire education and more, money that these people had hidden from me while I worked multiple jobs to pay for school, while I accumulated debt, while I struggled financially for years. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I felt physically sick. These people hadn't just stolen my identity. They'd stolen my family, my history, my inheritance, and my future. They'd let me believe I was alone in the world while my real family was out there somewhere, probably still searching for me. "We have to tell him," Patricia said finally. "Today, after everything settles down from graduation. We can't keep living this lie." "Tell him what?" Kenneth asked. "That we've been lying to him for 18 years. That his real family is out there somewhere, probably thinking he's dead. That we've been keeping money that belongs to him. He'll never forgive us. Maybe that's what we deserve," Patricia replied. I heard Sarah's footsteps on the stairs and quickly moved away from the kitchen doorway. She found me standing in the living room, staring at the scattered photos from the album that had fallen to the floor. "Alex, are you okay?" she asked, immediately noticing my state. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked at her, this woman I loved and planned to marry, and realized I didn't even know how to begin explaining what I'd discovered. How do you tell someone that everything they know about you is a lie? How do you explain that you've just learned you're not even the person you thought you were? "I need to get out of here," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked confused but didn't argue. She could see something was seriously wrong. "Okay, let's go. Do you want to say goodbye to your parents?" "They're not my parents," I said, the words feeling strange and foreign in my mouth. Before Sarah could ask what I meant, Patricia and Kenneth emerged from the kitchen. The moment they saw my face, they knew that I had heard everything. Patricia went pale and Kenneth's shoulders sagged as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally become too much to bear. "Alexander," Patricia started, but I cut her off. "That's not my name," I said quietly. "My name is Michael, and you are not my parents." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked back and forth between us, trying to understand what was happening. Patricia began to cry, and Kenneth just stood there looking defeated. "How long were you planning to keep lying to me?" I asked, my voice growing stronger as the shock began to give way to anger. "Were you ever going to tell me the truth? Were you going to let me live my entire life not knowing who I really am?" "We wanted to tell you," Kenneth said weakly. "We always planned to tell you when you were older, but it was easier to keep lying," I finished. "Easier to keep pretending you were my family while my real family was out there somewhere, probably mourning me, probably thinking I was dead. It wasn't like that," Patricia said through her tears. "We loved you. We raised you. We did our best to give you a good life. With my own money," I said, my voice now hard with anger. "With the inheritance from my real parents that you've been hiding from me for 18 years. The look of shock on their faces told me they hadn't expected me to know about that part. They'd been caught in their lie completely, with no room for denial or explanation. "We can explain everything," Kenneth said desperately. "If you'll just let us—" "Explain what?" I interrupted. "Explain how you stole a traumatized child and convinced him he belonged to you? Explain how you kept him from his real family for 18 years? Explain how you let him struggle financially while hiding his inheritance? What exactly is there to explain?" Sarah grabbed my arm gently. "Alex, maybe we should sit down and talk about this calmly." "My name is Michael," I said again, looking at her. "And I don't want to talk about this calmly. I want to know who I really am. I want to find my real family, and I want these people to pay for what they've done to me." Over the next few hours, the full scope of their deception came out. I learned that my real name was Michael Chen. My parents, David and Lisa Chen, had died in a car accident when I was 4 years old. At the time of their deaths, I had been staying with the Morrisons, who were family friends, while my parents were away on a business trip. The plan had been for me to stay with them for just a week, but when my parents died, instead of contacting my extended family as they were supposed to do, the Morrisons made a decision that would change my life forever. They saw an opportunity to have the child they'd never been able to conceive naturally, and they took it. They moved to a different state, changed my last name, and began raising me as their own son. Meanwhile, my real family, the Chens, had been searching for me for 18 years. My grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, an entire extended family that I'd never known existed, had never stopped looking for me. They'd hired private investigators, worked with police departments across multiple states, and maintained a website with my photo and information, hoping that someone, somewhere, would recognize me and come forward. The life insurance money from my parents' deaths, $300,000, had been placed in a trust fund with the Morrisons as temporary guardians. When I wasn't returned to my family, that money had remained in their control, technically meant for my care and education, but in practice hidden from me while I struggled through college with student loans and part-time jobs. But perhaps the most devastating part of the revelation was learning about the family I'd been stolen from. The Chens were a large, close-knit family. I had 2 sets of grandparents who were still alive, 4 aunts and uncles, and 12 cousins. I had been the only child of my generation when I disappeared, and my absence had left a hole in the family that had never healed. As I sat in that living room, looking at photos of my real family that Patricia reluctantly retrieved from a hidden box in their bedroom, I felt a grief so profound it was almost unbearable. These weren't just strangers. Looking at their faces, I could see resemblances, familiar features that I'd never understood about myself. The shape of my eyes, the structure of my cheekbones, the way I smiled, all of it made sense now. In one photo, I saw my real father as a young man, and it was like looking into a mirror. We had the same nose, the same jawline, the same way of standing. In another photo, I saw my real mother holding a baby that was unmistakably me, her face radiant with joy and love. These were my people, my blood, my family, and I'd been stolen from them before I was old enough to even remember their faces. The Morrisons sat in their chairs like defendants awaiting sentencing, which, in a way, they were. They'd confessed to 18 years of deception, identity theft, and fraud. They'd stolen not just me, but my inheritance, my family connections, and my entire sense of self. But I wasn't interested in their excuses or apologies anymore. As the magnitude of what they'd done became clear, my shock and grief began to transform into something else, a cold, calculating anger that would drive every decision I made going forward. "I want you to know something," I said to them as Sarah and I prepared to leave that house for the last time. "This isn't over. What you've done to me, what you've done to my real family, there will be consequences for all of it." "Alexander, please," Patricia begged. "We know we made mistakes, but we love you. We raised you. That has to count for something." "My name is Michael," I said for what felt like the 100th time that day. "And you don't love me. You love the idea of me, the fantasy child you created to fill the void in your own lives. You never loved me enough to tell me the truth. You never loved me enough to let me know my real family. And you never loved me enough to give me access to my own inheritance. That's not love. That's selfishness. Plain and simple." I picked up the photos of my real family and the documents Patricia had given me with their contact information. "And now you're going to pay for that selfishness in ways you can't even imagine." That night, back in my dorm room with Sarah beside me, I began the process of reclaiming my life. The first call I made was to the number Patricia had given me for my grandmother, Helen Chen. When she answered the phone and I said the words, "This is Michael Chen, your grandson," the sound she made was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was a sob that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. 18 years of grief and hope and desperate love all released at once. "Michael," she whispered through her tears. "Oh my God, Michael, is it really you? We never stopped looking, baby. We never stopped believing you were out there somewhere." That conversation lasted 4 hours. I learned about my parents, about the family I'd been stolen from, about the traditions and culture I'd never been allowed to experience. I learned that my real father had been a brilliant engineer, just like me, and that my mother had been an artist. I learned that creativity and technical skill ran in my family, that my success in school and my natural abilities weren't random gifts, but inherited traits. I learned that my grandmother had kept my childhood bedroom exactly as it was when I disappeared, hoping that someday I'd come home. I learned that every year on my birthday, the entire family gathered to light candles and share memories of me, keeping my spirit alive even when they didn't know if I was still breathing. But most importantly, I learned that what the Morrisons had stolen from me wasn't just my identity or my money. They'd stolen love, belonging, culture, and connection from an entire family that had been incomplete without me. Over the next few weeks, as I began the legal process of reclaiming my identity and my inheritance, I also began planning my revenge against the people who had robbed me of 18 years of my life. I started by consulting with several attorneys, not just about recovering my money, but about the criminal charges that could be brought against the Morrisons. What they had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was criminal. They had committed kidnapping, identity theft, fraud, and theft of a minor's inheritance. The fact that their motives might have been sympathetic didn't change the fact that they had committed serious felonies. But I wanted more than just criminal charges. I wanted them to experience the same sense of loss and displacement that they had inflicted on me and my family. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to have your entire world revealed as a lie. My first move was to contact the local newspaper with my story. The reporter I spoke with was fascinated by the case and agreed to write a feature article about my situation. Within a week, the story was picked up by regional news outlets, and within a month, it had gone national. The headline read, "Local couple accused of stealing child's identity for 18 years." The article included photos of me as a child with the Morrisons and recent photos of me reuniting with my real family. It detailed the money they'd hidden from me, the family they'd kept me from, and the lies they'd maintained for nearly 2 decades. The public response was swift and devastating for the Morrisons. Kenneth's auto repair shop, which had been a respected local business for 20 years, suddenly found itself without customers. People canceled appointments, left negative reviews online, and spread the story throughout the community. Patricia's position at the hospital became untenable as colleagues and patients learned about the case, and she was forced to take a leave of absence that would eventually become permanent. But the media attention was just the beginning of their troubles. The legal consequences came next. Working with my attorneys, I filed both criminal complaints and civil lawsuits against the Morrisons. The criminal charges included kidnapping, child endangerment, identity theft, and fraud. The civil suit sought not only the return of my inheritance with 18 years of interest, but also damages for the emotional distress, lost family relationships, and educational expenses I'd incurred because of their actions. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The hidden documents Patricia had shown me included papers that proved they'd known how to contact my real family all along. There were copies of the life insurance policies, bank statements showing the money that had been kept from me, and even letters from my grandmother that had been sent to their old address years ago, looking for me. Perhaps most damning was a diary that Patricia had kept during my early years with them. In it, she detailed their decision to keep me, their guilt about lying to me, and their ongoing awareness that my real family was searching for me. Entries like, "Saw another missing child poster with his old photo today. Kenneth says we should take them down, but I can't bring myself to do it," showed that they had always known exactly what they were doing. The diary also revealed the extent of their deception. They had researched my real family, knew about my grandparents and aunts and uncles, and had actively worked to keep me from discovering the truth. When I'd asked questions about our family history as a child, they hadn't just been evasive. They'd been deliberately blocking my access to information about my real identity. As the legal proceedings unfolded, more details emerged that made their actions even more inexcusable. I learned that there had been multiple occasions over the years when they could have returned me to my family with minimal consequences, but they had chosen to maintain the lie instead. When I was 8 years old, my grandmother had hired a private investigator who had traced my location to within 50 miles of where we were living. The Morrisons had received a visit from the investigator, but instead of coming forward, They had lied and claimed they'd never heard of Michael Chen. They'd even provided false information to throw the investigation off track. When I was 12, my real aunt had moved to a town just 20 miles away for work. If the Morrisons had come forward then, I could have been reunited with my family while still having a relationship with them. Instead, they'd kept silent and even avoided that town entirely to prevent any chance encounters. Most heartbreakingly, I learned that my real grandfather had died just 2 years earlier, still searching for me, still hoping that someday he'd get to see his grandson again. The Morrisons' selfishness had cost me the chance to know him, to learn from him, to be part of his life and him part of mine. As these details became public through the legal proceedings and continued media coverage, the community's anger toward the Morrisons intensified. Their house was vandalized multiple times with graffiti calling them child thieves and liars. They received threatening phone calls and angry letters from strangers who had heard their story. But I wasn't satisfied with just public shame and legal consequences. I wanted them to feel the personal impact of what they'd done, to experience the same kind of loss and betrayal that I had suffered. That's when I implemented the most devastating part of my revenge plan. Through my research and legal discovery, I had learned everything about the Morrisons' finances, their social connections, and their personal lives. I knew about their friends, their extended family relationships, and their community standing, and I knew exactly how to systematically dismantle all of it. I started with their friends and social circle. Using the media attention around my case, I reached out to everyone the Morrisons had considered close friends over the years. I didn't need to lie or exaggerate. I simply told them the truth about what had been done to me and asked them to consider whether they wanted to continue associating with people who had committed such acts. The response was immediate and total. Friends who had known the Morrisons for decades cut off contact completely. Their church community, where they had been active members for 15 years, asked them to find another congregation. Social clubs and community organizations quietly removed them from membership rolls. Within 6 months, the Morrisons went from being respected members of their community to complete social pariahs. They couldn't go to the grocery store or attend public events without encountering people who knew their story and wanted nothing to do with them. But I wasn't finished. I also reached out to their extended family members, people I'd met over the years at holidays and family gatherings but had never felt connected to. When I told them the truth about who I was and what had been done to me, their reactions ranged from shock to disgust to anger at having been unknowingly complicit in the Morrisons' lies. Kenneth's sister, who had always doted on me as her nephew, was particularly devastating in her response. She wrote a letter to Kenneth that was later included in the court proceedings, expressing her horror at learning that she had been celebrating holidays and sharing family moments with a stolen child, never knowing that somewhere my real family was grieving my absence. The psychological impact on the Morrisons was evident. Patricia had what appeared to be a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized briefly for depression and anxiety. Kenneth aged visibly, his hair going completely gray in a matter of months, his posture becoming stooped and defeated. But the most satisfying part of my revenge was still to come. As part of the legal settlement, the Morrisons were required to not only return my inheritance with interest, but also pay substantial damages for their actions. The total amount came to nearly $600,000, money they didn't have and couldn't raise without selling everything they owned. They were forced to sell their house, the house where I'd grown up believing I belonged, where they'd maintained the lie for 18 years. They had to sell Kenneth's auto repair business, the business that had been his life's work and his source of identity. They had to liquidate their retirement savings, their personal belongings, everything they'd built over their adult lives. In the end, they lost not just their money and property, but their entire way of life. They were forced to move to a small apartment in a different town, where no one knew their story, where they could try to start over as people approaching 60 with nothing to show for their lives, except shame and regret. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding my life in ways I'd never imagined possible. The money I recovered allowed me to pay off my student loans immediately and still have substantial funds for my future. But more importantly, I was finally able to know and be part of my real family. My reunion with my grandmother, Helen Chen, was the most emotional moment of my life. When I walked into her house for the first time, she just stood there crying and repeating, "You came home, baby. You finally came home. The bedroom she'd kept for me was exactly as she'd described, a shrine to the little boy I'd been when I was taken, but also a beacon of hope that had guided her through 18 years of not knowing if I was alive or dead. Meeting my aunts and uncles and cousins was like discovering entire parts of myself I'd never known existed. They welcomed me not as a stranger, but as the missing piece of their family that had finally been returned. They shared stories about my parents, showed me photos and videos I'd never seen, and helped me understand where my talents and interests came from. I learned that my father's love of engineering wasn't just a career choice, but a family tradition going back generations. I learned that my mother's artistic abilities lived on in several of my cousins who were painters and musicians. I learned about traditions and cultural practices that felt both foreign and familiar, like recovered memories of a life I'd been meant to live. Most importantly, I learned what it felt like to truly belong somewhere, to be part of a family that had chosen to love me not out of desperation or selfishness, but simply because I was theirs by blood and birth and right. The contrast between my new life with my real family and the hollow existence I'd had with the Morrisons was stark and painful. With the Chens, every conversation felt natural and connected. There was no invisible wall, no sense that I was performing or trying to be someone I wasn't. I was simply Michael, their grandson, their nephew, their cousin, the boy who'd been lost and was now found. As I settled into my new life and my new identity, I began to understand the full scope of what the Morrisons had stolen from me. It wasn't just 18 years of my life or the money they'd hidden, or even the family connections they'd severed. They'd stolen my sense of self, my understanding of where I came from and who I was meant to be. But they'd also given me something, though I doubt they intended it. They'd given me the perspective to truly appreciate what I'd been missing. Having lived without belonging, without real family connection, without cultural identity, I understood the value of these things in a way that someone who'd always had them might not. And they'd given me the motivation to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to another child. Working with my attorneys and victims' rights organizations, I began advocating for stronger laws around child identification and family reunification. I shared my story at conferences and seminars, helping train social workers and law enforcement officers to recognize signs of stolen identity cases. The Morrisons, meanwhile, disappeared into obscurity. After the legal proceedings concluded and they'd lost everything, they moved away from the area entirely. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd relocated to a different state, where they were living quietly and keeping to themselves. Patricia had developed serious health problems, apparently stress-related, and was no longer able to work. Kenneth had found employment at another auto repair shop, but as a mechanic rather than an owner, working for someone else for the first time in decades. They'd lost not just their money and their social standing, but their sense of themselves as good people who'd done a difficult thing for noble reasons. The legal proceedings and media coverage had forced them to confront the reality of what they'd done, to see it not as a loving rescue of a traumatized child, but as a selfish theft that had caused immeasurable damage to multiple families. I never saw them again after the day I left their house following my graduation. I had no desire to confront them further or to hear their apologies or explanations. They'd had 18 years to tell me the truth, 18 years to do the right thing, and they'd chosen deception every single day. Nothing they could say now would change that or repair the damage they'd done. But I did hear from them once, about 2 years after everything had concluded. Patricia sent me a letter forwarded through my attorneys. It was a rambling, emotional plea for forgiveness, filled with justifications and explanations, and expressions of love that rang hollow after everything I'd learned. The letter talked about how they'd truly believed they were doing what was best for me, how they'd grown to love me as their own son, how they'd wanted to tell me the truth but were afraid of losing me. It painted a picture of themselves as tragic figures, well-meaning people who'd made a terrible mistake and had been too afraid to correct it. But what struck me most about the letter was what it didn't say. It didn't acknowledge the damage they'd done to my real family, the 18 years of grief and uncertainty they'd caused my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, my cousins. It didn't acknowledge the money they'd kept from me while I struggled financially. It didn't acknowledge the identity and culture they'd stolen from me. Even in their apology, they were still making it about themselves, still trying to justify their actions, still refusing to fully confront the magnitude of what they'd done. It confirmed for me that my decision to cut them out of my life completely had been the right one. I never responded to the letter. Instead, I added it to the collection of documents I was keeping for the book I was planning to write about my experience. By my 3rd year of working as an engineer, I had decided to tell my full story in a memoir. The book would detail not just the discovery of the truth about my identity, but the complete process of rebuilding my life, reconnecting with my real family, and seeking justice for what had been done to me. Working with a literary agent and eventually a major publisher, I spent 2 years crafting Stolen Identity: How I Discovered My Life Was a Lie and Found My Way Home. The book became a bestseller, reaching the top of several non-fiction charts and staying there for months. The success of the book brought renewed media attention to my case, but this time, I was in control of the narrative. I appeared on major television shows, gave interviews to national magazines, and spoke at conferences around the country. Each appearance brought new attention to the issue of stolen identity and family separation, but it also served as a constant reminder to anyone who knew the Morrisons of what they had done. The book's success also brought financial rewards that far exceeded even my recovered inheritance. Between book sales, speaking fees, and film rights that were optioned by a major studio, I found myself financially secure in ways I'd never imagined. But more importantly, the book gave me a platform to advocate for other victims and to work toward preventing similar crimes. One of the most satisfying aspects of the book's publication was learning about its impact on the Morrisons themselves. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that they had tried desperately to prevent the book's publication, hiring lawyers to explore whether they had any legal grounds to stop it. When they learned that everything in the book was factually accurate and legally protected, they had begged me through intermediaries to at least change their names. I refused. They had stolen my identity for 18 years, and I saw no reason to protect theirs now. Every person who read that book would know exactly who Patricia and Kenneth Morrison were and what they had done. Their names would be forever associated with one of the most notorious cases of identity theft and child exploitation in recent memory. The book also prompted new investigations into their past. Journalists and researchers began looking into whether they had committed similar crimes before taking me, or whether there were other victims they hadn't discovered. While no additional crimes were uncovered, the investigation revealed a pattern of deception and manipulation in their personal relationships that painted a picture of people who were comfortable with lies and boundary violations. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for the Morrisons came from an unexpected source: their own extended family members who had unknowingly participated in my upbringing. Kenneth's sister, whom I mentioned earlier, had been horrified to learn the truth about my identity. But her reaction went beyond just cutting contact with her brother. She began her own investigation into how she and other family members had been deceived, and what she discovered led her to write her own book, How My Brother Made Me an Accessory to Kidnapping. Her book detailed the signs she now realized she should have noticed, the questions she should have asked, and the guilt she felt for having celebrated holidays and family milestones with a stolen child while somewhere my real family was grieving. But more than that, it revealed additional details about the Morrisons' deception that even I hadn't known. She had copies of conversations where Patricia and Kenneth had discussed their fear of being caught, their awareness that what they were doing was wrong, and their ongoing efforts to maintain the deception. She revealed that they had actually moved several times during my childhood specifically to avoid potential discovery, and that they had coached me on how to respond if anyone ever asked detailed questions about my early childhood. Most damning of all, she revealed that Kenneth had once confessed to her during a family gathering that he sometimes felt guilty about keeping me from my real family, but that he couldn't bear the thought of losing me after all those years. This confession, made when he was drinking and thought no one else was listening, proved that their claims of believing they were acting in my best interest were lies. The publication of his sister's book created a new wave of media attention and public outrage. Here was someone from their own family confirming that the Morrisons had always known what they were doing was wrong, had always been aware that they were keeping me from people who loved and missed me, and had chosen their own desires over my right to know my real identity. The impact on their remaining family relationships was devastating. Kenneth's parents, who were still alive and in their 80s, publicly disowned him after reading their daughter's book. Patricia's siblings, who had maintained some contact even after the initial scandal, cut off all communication. They found themselves completely isolated from everyone they had ever been close to. But my revenge didn't end with their social and familial isolation. I had one final move that would ensure they could never escape the consequences of their actions. Working with a team of digital marketing experts, I created a comprehensive online presence around my story. Every search for either Patricia or Kenneth Morrison would bring up detailed results about their crimes. Their names were associated with websites, articles, videos, and social media posts that ensured anyone considering hiring them, renting to them, or entering into any kind of relationship with them would immediately learn about their past. This wasn't just vindictive, it was protective. I wanted to ensure that they would never be in a position to take advantage of another vulnerable person or child. By making their history easily discoverable, I was creating a permanent warning system that would follow them wherever they went. The strategy was incredibly effective. I learned through various sources that Kenneth had been fired from his job at the auto repair shop after customers complained about the negative attention his presence brought to the business. Patricia had been unable to find any work in healthcare, her chosen profession, because background checks immediately revealed her criminal history and civil judgments. They were forced to move multiple times as landlords discovered their identity and asked them to leave. They struggled to maintain bank accounts, credit cards, and other basic financial services, as their names triggered fraud alerts and special scrutiny. In effect, they were living the kind of marginalized, uncertain existence that they had condemned me to when they stole my identity. They couldn't build stable lives because their past followed them everywhere, just as my stolen identity had made it impossible for me to ever feel truly grounded or secure in my sense of self. 5 years after the initial discovery, I received word that Patricia had died. The death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, but those who knew the family said she had essentially died of shame and stress. The constant scrutiny, the social isolation, and the weight of what she had done had taken a toll on her health that her body couldn't sustain. I felt no satisfaction in her death, but I also felt no grief. She had made choices that caused immeasurable harm to me and my family, and the consequences of those choices had eventually overwhelmed her. It was a tragic end to a life that could have been lived honorably if she had chosen differently at crucial moments. Kenneth attended her funeral alone. Even their adult children from previous relationships, whom I had met during my childhood, had distanced themselves from their parents after learning the truth. He buried his wife with no family support, no community sympathy, and no hope of redemption. The final chapter of my revenge came 2 years later, when Kenneth himself died in a car accident. I learned about his death not from any remaining family or friends, but from a Google alert I had set up to monitor mentions of their names online. His obituary was brief and factual, listing basic biographical information and no survivors. There were no heartfelt tributes, no fond memories shared by friends, no outpouring of community support. He had died as he had lived his final years, alone, isolated, and carrying the weight of his unforgivable choices. At his funeral, there were fewer than 10 people present, most of them strangers who had known him only briefly from his final job or apartment building. I was not among them, but I learned about the sparse attendance from a local reporter who had covered my original story and was following up on the final chapter. With both of the Morrisons dead, my revenge was complete, but it had evolved far beyond simple retribution. It had become a systematic dismantling of the lives they had built on lies, a removal of their ability to hurt others, and a restoration of truth to replace the deception they had maintained for so long. But more importantly, their downfall had been the foundation for my own rise. The money I recovered from them, combined with the success of my book and speaking career, had given me the resources to build something meaningful with my life. I had used my platform to help other victims of identity theft and family separation, working with law enforcement and social services to improve systems for reuniting families and protecting children. I had established a foundation in my real parents' names, using part of my inheritance and book proceeds to fund services for families dealing with missing children and identity theft. The David and Lisa Chen Foundation had helped dozens of families over the years, providing resources for private investigators, legal assistance, and counseling services. My relationship with my real family had deepened and flourished over the years. I had walked my cousin Jennifer down the aisle at her wedding, been present for the birth of several new babies in the family, and spent countless holidays and celebrations surrounded by people who loved me simply because I belonged with them. I had married Sarah in a ceremony that was everything the Morrisons had tried to prevent, a true celebration of family and belonging, attended by people who had known and loved me my entire life, even during the years when I was lost to them. My grandmother, now in her 80s but still sharp and loving, had cried tears of joy as she watched me marry the woman I loved, finally able to celebrate the milestones in my life that she had been denied for so many years. Sarah and I now had 2 children of our own, and they were growing up surrounded by the love and cultural richness that had been stolen from me. They knew their grandparents, their great-grandmother, their aunts and uncles and cousins. They understood their heritage and their place in the family story. They would never experience the isolation and confusion that had defined my childhood. As I sit here now, 15 years after that devastating graduation day, when I learned the truth about my identity, I can honestly say that the Morrisons' betrayal became the catalyst for the best parts of my life. Their lies forced me to discover who I really was. Their selfishness taught me the value of genuine family love, and their crimes gave me a platform to help others avoid similar fates. They stole 18 years of my life, but in doing so, they inadvertently gave me something even more valuable, a deep appreciation for truth, family, and belonging that I might never have developed if I hadn't experienced their loss. They tried to steal my identity, but instead, they helped me discover my true self in ways that went far beyond just knowing my real name. The revenge I took against them was complete and devastating, but it was also constructive. Every consequence they faced served a greater purpose, protecting other potential victims, educating the public about these crimes, and building resources to help other families recover from similar traumas. In the end, Patricia and Kenneth Morrison died as they had lived their final years. Alone, ashamed, and forgotten, they had tried to build their happiness on a foundation of lies and theft, and that foundation had inevitably crumbled beneath them. But I had built my new life on a foundation of truth, family, and justice, and that foundation had proven strong enough to support not just my own happiness, but a legacy of helping others that would continue long after I was gone. They thought they were taking everything from me when they stole my identity and kept me from my family. Instead, they gave me the motivation and the platform to build something far greater than anything they had ever imagined possible. That is the ultimate revenge. Not just destroying those who wronged you, but using their betrayal as the foundation for creating something beautiful and meaningful that they could never have achieved themselves. The Morrisons are gone now, their names remembered only as cautionary tales of selfishness and deception. But my story, my family, and my work continue to grow and flourish, proving that truth and love will always triumph over lies and theft in the end. If you enjoyed this revenge story, smash that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in this situation. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss when I upload new content.